A father stops by his daughter's school to check on her, only to witness a horrifying act by her teacher during lunch. What he sees on her tray leaves him no choice but to call 911. The school tries to cover it up, but it's too late. The fight for justice has just begun. Subscribe now. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. Daryl stood outside the large brick building, clutching his daughter Samantha's hand. The new school loomed in front of them, pristine and polished, with bright banners waving cheerfully in the morning breeze. Parents and children streamed in through the front gates, the excitement of a new school year buzzing all around. Samantha glanced nervously at her father. He squeezed her hand gently, giving her a reassuring smile. "You've got this, sweetheart," Daryl whispered. "A new start, remember?" Samantha nodded, though the look in her eyes was uncertain. It had only been a few months since they left her old school, where she'd experienced more than her fair share of isolation and bullying. This time was supposed to be different. Daryl had carefully selected this school, believing its polished reputation and commitment to diversity would offer Samantha the fresh start she desperately needed. As they walked through the front entrance, they were greeted by a polished woman in a bright green scarf. "Good morning. Welcome to Maplewood Elementary," she chirped, handing them an orientation packet. "We're so glad to have Samantha join us." Samantha clutched the packet nervously, scanning the hall filled with students. Some children smiled at her, others barely acknowledged her presence, but Daryl felt optimistic. Everything seemed perfect so far: welcoming smiles, colorful posters about inclusiveness on the walls, and enthusiastic teachers rushing past to prepare for the day. When they finally reached Samantha's new classroom, Daryl knelt beside her. "If you need anything at all, you just call me, okay?" Samantha gave him a small smile, the kind that almost reached her eyes. "Okay, Dad." Inside the classroom, Daryl was introduced to Mr. Brown, Samantha's new teacher. The man's warm handshake and easy smile seemed to put both of them at ease. Mr. Brown had the kind of presence that could fill a room, with his friendly demeanor and crisp white shirt neatly tucked into pressed slacks. Yet there was something in his gaze, just a flicker, a momentary tightness in his smile. That gave Daryl pause, but he quickly dismissed it. He was determined to trust that this time things would be different. "Well, Samantha, we're very excited to have you," Mr. Brown said cheerfully. "Let's find you a seat, shall we?" Daryl watched as Mr. Brown led Samantha to a desk near the back of the room. It was odd. There were empty seats closer to the front, but Daryl brushed off the discomfort. "It's just a seating arrangement," he told himself. "No need to overthink it." Samantha gave him a small wave as he turned to leave. The first week passed without major incidents, but tiny moments of exclusion began to accumulate, like stones quietly placed in a bag too heavy to carry. Samantha noticed it first at recess, when the other children quickly filled the teams for a soccer game, leaving her standing awkwardly at the sidelines. When she approached a group of girls playing hopscotch, they abruptly stopped, claiming the game was over. At first, she tried not to dwell on it. Kids were kids, she told herself. Maybe they just didn't know her yet, but the avoidance became more deliberate as the days wore on. Samantha's seat was always just slightly away from the main group, making it difficult for her to participate in conversations. At lunchtime, the students she tried sitting with suddenly remembered they had somewhere else to be, leaving her to eat alone at the far end of the table. Mr. Brown didn't help matters either. He seemed friendly on the surface, always greeting Samantha with a broad smile, but his actions suggested otherwise. He often forgot to call on her when she raised her hand, and on the rare occasions when she answered a question correctly, he downplayed her success. "Good guess," he'd say dismissively, as though her efforts were nothing more than luck. Back at home, Daryl noticed the changes in his daughter almost immediately. Samantha, who used to chatter endlessly about her day, now grew quiet at the dinner table. When he asked her how school was going, she gave short, vague responses. "It's fine," she'd say, poking at her food with her fork. "Just fine." Daryl tried to remain optimistic. "You just need some time to get settled, sweetheart. These things take time." But as the days stretched into weeks, Samantha's demeanor grew more withdrawn. She no longer looked forward to school and began asking if she could stay home more often. "Do you want to talk about what's bothering you?" Daryl asked her one evening after she had refused to come out of her room. Samantha hesitated, then shook her head. "It's nothing, Dad. I'll be okay." But Daryl knew better. He could see the sadness weighing on her small shoulders, the way her once bright eyes had dulled. Something was wrong, and it was more than just the usual challenges of adjusting to a new school. Determined to get to the bottom of things, Daryl decided to pay closer attention. He attended every parent meeting and volunteered for school activities whenever his schedule allowed. But every time he tried to bring up Samantha's struggles, the teachers and other parents would shrug it off. "She's probably just adjusting," they'd say. "Kids go through these phases." Even Mr. Brown had little to offer when Daryl asked him directly. "Samantha's doing fine," he said with a practiced smile. "She's just a bit shy, nothing to worry about." Despite these reassurances, Daryl's gut told him otherwise. He couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was going on beneath the surface. His instincts had never failed him before, and they were screaming at him now to stay vigilant. The first major incident happened one Thursday afternoon. Daryl arrived at the school earlier than usual to pick up Samantha, hoping to surprise her. As he approached the classroom door, he saw Samantha sitting alone at the back of the room while the other children were gathered in groups, chatting excitedly about an upcoming class project. Mr. Brown stood at the front, scrolling through his tablet, completely indifferent to the exclusion happening right under his nose. Later that evening, Samantha confessed to her father that she had not been included in the group project. "Mr. Brown said there weren't enough materials," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. Daryl's heart sank. The pattern was becoming clearer. Small slights, subtle exclusions, all building towards something larger. And it wasn't just the children. The real problem was Mr. Brown. As the weeks wore on, Daryl tried to keep things normal at home. He encouraged Samantha to focus on the things she loved: drawing, reading, and watching her favorite nature documentaries. But the joy in her seemed to fade a little more each day, and Daryl knew that unless he acted soon, he might lose the vibrant spark that made his daughter who she was. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Samantha leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you think things will ever get better, Dad?" she asked softly. Daryl kissed the top of her head and wrapped an arm around her. "They will, baby, I promise." But deep down, he wasn't so sure. Something dark was brewing in that school, and Daryl knew he needed to uncover the truth before it was too late. Samantha sat at the edge of her seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as Mr. Brown wrapped up the lesson. The morning sun cast a soft light through the classroom windows, but there was no warmth in the air. "Before we conclude," Mr. Brown said, scanning the classroom, "I'd like to remind everyone about the science fair coming up next month. We have high expectations this year, so make sure your projects are innovative and impressive." A wave of excitement rippled through the room. Samantha's heart lifted, if only briefly. Science was her favorite subject. She had already begun working on a project about space exploration, something she was deeply passionate about. But when she raised her hand to share her idea, Mr. Brown's gaze slid over her as if she were invisible. Instead, he called on a boy sitting in the front row. "What do you have in mind, Max?" As Max explained his idea, something Samantha knew wasn't nearly as detailed as her own, her heart sank. This was becoming the norm, being overlooked, ignored, and belittled. The more the days went by, the worse it became. Mr. Brown's dismissals were subtle but deliberate. He never outright insulted Samantha, but he made sure she felt small. When she excelled in an assignment, he would hand it back with a tight smile. "Not bad for a first try," he would say, as if her success was an anomaly. It wasn't long before the other children began mirroring his behavior. They took cues from his silent disapproval, distancing themselves from Samantha. During recess, her classmates would huddle in groups, whispering and giggling, while she sat alone on the swings. Sometimes, one of the children would glance in her direction with a smirk, as if sharing an inside joke she wasn't a part of. "Why won't they let me play with them?" Samantha whispered one day, her voice barely audible as she sat on the couch next to her father. The sadness in her eyes broke Daryl's heart. "They just need time, baby," he lied, though every fiber of his being told him otherwise. The tension between Samantha and Mr. Brown finally boiled over during a spelling quiz. Samantha raised her hand to ask for clarification on a question, but Mr. Brown cut her off mid-sentence. "Do you really not know that word, Samantha? It's quite simple." His voice carried a tone of mockery, and the class burst into quiet snickers. Samantha flushed with humiliation, tears welling up in her eyes. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the seat and escape the weight of their stares. After the quiz, she gathered her things in silence, but Mr. Brown wasn't done. "Let's not make excuses for poor performance, Samantha," he said with a forced smile. "You need to work harder if you want to keep up." That was the moment Samantha snapped. "I did work hard," she shouted, the words escaping before she could stop them. The class fell into stunned silence. No one had ever seen Samantha raise her voice before. Mr. Brown's face twisted into a cold smile. "That attitude won't get you far here," he said icily. The incident earned her a detention, an unfair punishment for simply standing up for herself. When she tried to explain what had happened to Daryl later that evening, her voice trembled with frustration. "It's like he hates me, Dad, and the other kids, they act like I don't exist." Daryl clenched his fist, trying to keep his anger in check. He knew now that the problem wasn't just Samantha's imagination. Something was seriously wrong, and he needed to figure out exactly what was happening at that school. The final straw came during a group project assignment. Each student was supposed to pair with a classmate, but when it was Samantha's turn to choose, no one volunteered to partner with her. "Looks like you'll have to work alone, Samantha," Mr. Brown said with a mock sigh, as if he were deeply inconvenienced. Samantha bit her lip, fighting back tears. The isolation was suffocating. She could feel the weight of her classmates' indifference pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. That evening, Daryl sat at the kitchen table, his mind racing. He could see the changes in his daughter clearly now. Samantha, once vibrant and curious, was retreating into herself, her enthusiasm replaced by a dull sadness. She barely spoke during dinner and spent most of her time alone in her room. Daryl knew he couldn't wait any longer. He needed answers. The next day, he cleared his schedule and decided to stay near the school during lunchtime. If something was happening, he was determined to see it with his own eyes. The cafeteria buzzed with the chatter of students as Daryl observed from a distance. He leaned against the wall near the entrance, careful not to attract attention. His heart raced as he scanned the crowd for his daughter. When he finally spotted Samantha, she was sitting at a table by herself, her tray untouched. The other children were scattered across the room, talking and laughing, but no one sat near her. Daryl's jaw tightened. Then he saw Mr. Brown. The teacher strolled into the cafeteria with an air of authority, a tray balanced in his hands. He stopped near Samantha's table, and what happened next sent a chill down Daryl's spine. With deliberate precision, Mr. Brown placed a dirty boot on Samantha's tray and smirked. Samantha stared at the boot in disbelief, her small hands trembling. Her teacher, the person who was supposed to protect and guide her, had humiliated her in front of everyone. But that wasn't all. Before walking away, Mr. Brown grabbed a bottle of ketchup from another table. With a twisted grin, he squeezed out the word "nigga" on her plate. The students nearby snickered, and no one made a move to stop him. Samantha sat frozen, tears pooling in her eyes. From his spot by the entrance, Daryl's blood ran cold. The rage that surged through him was unlike anything he had ever felt. His hands shook as he reached for his phone, dialing the police before he could think twice. "Yes, I need to report an incident," he said through gritted teeth, his voice low with barely restrained fury. "At Maplewood Elementary, right now." The sight of his daughter, humiliated and broken, ignited a fire in him that couldn't be extinguished. This was no longer just about Samantha. This was about every child who had ever been silenced, every student who had been made to feel less than. And Daryl was going to make sure it stopped. Daryl charged into the cafeteria with his fists clenched, his heart pounding in his chest. He had seen enough. The moment Mr. Brown placed the dirty boot on Samantha's tray and smeared the vile slur across her plate, something inside him snapped. As he crossed the room, heads turned. Students paused mid-laughter, sensing the storm brewing. Mr. Brown stood at Samantha's table, still smirking, unaware that his reckoning was upon him. "Samantha," Daryl called, his voice firm but filled with concern. Samantha's head shot up at the sound of his voice, her wide eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Relief washed over her face, though it was mixed with the humiliation of everything that had just transpired. Daryl stepped between Mr. Brown and his daughter, shielding her from the man who had caused her so much pain. He stared Mr. Brown down, his jaw tight with controlled fury. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Daryl growled, his voice low but dangerous. Mr. Brown blinked, momentarily taken aback by the sudden intrusion, but he quickly composed himself, offering a condescending smile. "Mr. Thomas, there's no need to overreact. We were just having a little fun." Daryl's nostrils flared as he stepped closer, towering over Mr. Brown. "Fun?" he repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. "Humiliating my daughter in front of everyone? Writing a slur on her plate? You think that's fun?" Mr. Brown's smile faltered for a moment, but then his expression hardened. "Look, it was just a joke. Kids need to toughen up. Don't you dare try to justify this," Daryl snapped, cutting him off. "You're supposed to be a teacher, not a bully." Mr. Brown's eyes narrowed, and he crossed his arms over his chest as if daring Daryl to push further. The students, cafeteria staff, and other teachers watched in stunned silence, unsure whether to intervene or let the confrontation unfold. Daryl knelt beside Samantha, gently wiping the tears from her cheeks. "It's okay, baby," he whispered. "I'm here now." He glanced at the tray in front of her, the dirty boot, the ketchup smeared in an unforgivable word, and felt a fresh wave of anger surge through him. Without hesitation, he pulled out his phone and dialed the police. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher asked. "I need officers at Maplewood Elementary," Darrell said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "An adult has verbally and physically harassed my daughter. I want him arrested." Mr. Brown's face paled. He took a step back, his bravado suddenly slipping. "Wait, hold on. This isn't necessary," he stammered, glancing nervously at the growing crowd of students and staff. "Oh, it's necessary," Darrell said coldly, glaring at the man who had tormented his child, "and you're not going anywhere." The minutes stretched painfully long as they waited for the police to arrive. Mr. Brown shifted uneasily, trying to salvage the situation. "Look, Mr. Thomas," he began, his tone desperate now, "maybe we can talk about this. No need to blow things out of proportion." Darrell let out a bitter laugh, the sound sharp and full of disdain. "Out of proportion? You've been bullying my daughter for weeks. I've watched you push her to the edge, and now you have the nerve to act like this is just a misunderstanding?" Mr. Brown opened his mouth to protest, but Darrell raised a hand, silencing him. "I'm done listening to your excuses." At that moment, the double doors of the cafeteria swung open, and 2 police officers entered. Their uniforms gleamed under the fluorescent lights as they approached the scene. One officer, a younger man with a stern expression, immediately noticed the boot on Samantha's tray and the offensive word scrawled in ketchup. "Who's responsible for this?" the officer demanded, his eyes flicking between Darrell and Mr. Brown. "He is," Darrell said, pointing directly at the teacher. "That man, Mr. Brown." The officer's gaze hardened as he turned to Mr. Brown. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with us." Mr. Brown took a step back, raising his hands defensively. "This is ridiculous. I didn't do anything wrong. It was just a joke." The officers weren't swayed. "We'll let the investigation determine that," one of them said firmly. "For now, you're under arrest for harassment and misconduct." As they moved to handcuff him, Mr. Brown tried to resist. "You can't do this," he shouted, struggling against their grip. "I've been teaching here for years. I'm not a criminal." The officers wrestled him into submission, securing the handcuffs with a metallic click. The students watched, wide-eyed, as their once powerful teacher was reduced to a desperate man, squirming under the weight of justice. Darrell stood protectively beside Samantha, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You're going to answer for everything you've done," he said quietly, his words filled with resolve. Mr. Brown sneered as the officers began escorting him away. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath, shooting a venomous glance at Darrell. Darrell didn't flinch. He stared the man down, unyielding. "Oh, it's over," he said, his voice like steel. "For you, it's just beginning." As the officers led Mr. Brown out of the cafeteria, murmurs spread through the crowd. Some students whispered to each other, still processing what they had just witnessed. A few teachers exchanged uncomfortable glances, realizing they had turned a blind eye to Mr. Brown's behavior for far too long. The principal arrived moments later, his face pale with shock. "Mr. Thomas, I had no idea this was happening," he stammered, wringing his hands nervously. Darrell shot him a cold look. "That's the problem," he said flatly. "You didn't know because you didn't care enough to find out." The principal opened his mouth to respond, but Darrell didn't wait for an apology. He was done with excuses. Back at the table, Samantha clung to her father's side, her small frame trembling. Darrell knelt down to her level and gently tilted her chin up so their eyes met. "It's over now," he whispered, brushing a stray tear from her cheek. "You're safe, baby." Samantha sniffled and gave him a weak smile, her first real smile in weeks. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered. Daryl wrapped her in a warm embrace, holding her close. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of relief. Justice had been served, but their fight was far from over. The events of that day would ripple far beyond the walls of the school. Daryl knew the battle for his daughter's dignity was only just beginning. There would be investigations, hearings, and meetings with lawyers, but he was ready for it all, for Samantha, for every child who had ever been silenced, for justice. As he led Samantha out of the cafeteria, hand in hand, he made a silent vow. This would never happen again. Not to his daughter. Not to anyone. The arrest of Mr. Brown spread through the school like wildfire. By the end of the day, parents were calling the administration demanding explanations, and the local news channels were running stories about the incident. Daryl sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through social media posts as Samantha sat beside him. Her head rested on his shoulder, the exhaustion of the day's events weighing heavily on her small frame. "What are they saying?" Samantha asked quietly. Daryl glanced down at her, brushing a stray curl from her forehead. "A lot of people are standing with us, sweetheart. They're angry at what happened, and they should be." The media coverage of the incident grew quickly. News outlets picked up the story of the teacher arrested for harassing a student, with headlines calling attention to the racial slur used against Samantha. Advocacy groups demanded accountability, and social media exploded with outrage. #Justice for Samantha began trending, with people across the country sharing similar stories of discrimination in schools. Despite the outpouring of support, there were critics as well. Some argued that Daryl overreacted by involving the police, claiming that the situation should have been handled internally. Others downplayed the teacher's actions, dismissing them as a misunderstanding. But Daryl didn't care. He knew what his daughter had endured, and he wasn't going to let anyone minimize it. In the following days, the school announced a formal investigation. Mr. Brown was placed on administrative leave, and several other teachers were questioned about their knowledge of the incidents. The principal called Daryl into his office for a meeting, hoping to smooth things over and avoid further scandal. "We deeply regret what happened," the principal began, his voice tight with rehearsed sincerity. "This is not reflective of the values we uphold at Maplewood Elementary." Daryl leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "That's interesting," he said coldly, "because it looks like exactly the kind of thing that's been happening under your watch for a long time." The principal shifted uncomfortably. "We're committed to making changes." "Save it," Daryl interrupted, his voice calm but unyielding. "I don't want empty promises. I want action." Daryl hired a lawyer the next day. The attorney, a sharp-witted woman named Anita Reynolds, listened intently as Daryl explained everything that had happened to Samantha. "We're going to hold them accountable," Anita said, her tone unwavering. "This isn't just about compensation, it's about systemic change." Together, they filed a formal complaint against the school, seeking both damages and a comprehensive reform of its policies. They demanded the introduction of anti-bias training for teachers, a new oversight system to monitor student treatment, and clear guidelines for handling complaints of discrimination. The trauma she had endured wouldn't disappear overnight, but she found comfort in small victories, like the mornings when she woke up without dreading school, or the evenings when she laughed again at the dinner table. Daryl remained by her side through every step, patient and encouraging, helping her rebuild the confidence Mr. Brown had tried to tear down. One evening, as they sat on the porch together, Samantha spoke quietly. "I'm scared, Dad." Daryl wrapped an arm around her. "I know, baby, but you're not alone. We're going to get through this together." Samantha leaned into him, a flicker of hope lighting in her heart. "Do you think the new school will be different?" Daryl kissed the top of her head. "I think it'll be whatever you make of it." The court hearings stretched over the next several months, with witnesses testifying about Mr. Brown's behavior and the school's failure to address previous complaints. Samantha, though nervous, took the stand bravely, recounting everything she had endured. Her voice didn't waver, even when Mr. Brown's lawyer tried to undermine her story. In the end, the court ruled in favor of the Thomases. The school was ordered to pay damages and implement mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff. Mr. Brown was officially dismissed, and his teaching license was revoked. The victory was bittersweet. No amount of compensation could erase what Samantha had been through, but the reforms that followed would ensure that no other child would endure the same pain. The school revamped its policies, creating a safer and more inclusive environment for all students. Daryl and Samantha attended a community meeting where the new policies were announced. As the principal listed the changes, mandatory training, improved reporting systems, and student support programs, Daryl glanced down at his daughter. Samantha sat quietly, listening intently. For the first time in months, she didn't seem weighed down by fear. On the first day of the next school year, Samantha walked into her new school with her head held high. The fear that had haunted her was still there, but it no longer controlled her. She knew now that she was not alone, that she had her father by her side and a community that supported her. As Daryl watched her disappear into the building, a wave of pride and relief washed over him. They had fought for justice, and won. But more importantly, they had reclaimed something far more valuable: Samantha's sense of self-worth. Daryl stood outside for a moment longer, savoring the quiet triumph of the moment. The battle was over, but the lessons they had learned would stay with them forever. Justice had been served, and in its wake they had found something even more powerful: hope for a better future. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You don't want to miss what's coming next. And while you're here, check out more of our videos to see other powerful stories. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We'd love to know. Stay tuned, stay inspired, and we'll see you in the next one.